The volcanic ash on Peleliu's white beach clung to everything like talcum powder mixed with ground glass, as Staff Sergeant James Donovan crouched behind a shattered coconut log on the morning of September 17, 1944. In his hands, he held what appeared to be the most absurd field modification his company commander had ever witnessed: a standard M1 helmet mounted on a length of bamboo pole, stuffed with a rolled-up poncho to create the rough silhouette of a human head. 300 yards upslope, somewhere in the honeycomb of limestone caves that riddled Peleliu's central ridges, a Japanese sniper had killed 4 Marines in the past 6 hours. Each man had been shot while attempting to cross the same 30-yard gap between 2 defensive positions. The sniper's position remained unknown, despite repeated attempts to locate his muzzle flash. Donovan had watched 2 of those Marines die, including Private Morrison, a 19-year-old from Kansas who'd lasted exactly 4 seconds after breaking cover. The official Marine Corps tactical manual for counter-sniper operations was explicit. Employ designated marksmen with scoped rifles, coordinate with supporting artillery, use smoke to obscure movement, advance under covering fire. What the manual did not suggest, what no training at Camp Pendleton had covered, was what Donovan was about to attempt: deliberately exposing a decoy to draw sniper fire and triangulate the shooter's position through simple geometry and patience. Donovan had learned the value of decoys not from military training, but from hunting white-tailed deer in the hardwood forests of western Pennsylvania during the Depression. His father had taught him that deer, like all prey animals, fixated on movement. A hunter who stayed motionless could watch deer walk within 10 feet, but the slightest motion, a turned head or shifted weight, would send them crashing through the underbrush. The principle worked in reverse too. A hunter could draw a nervous buck into shooting range by placing a decoy, a doe silhouette carved from wood, in a clearing where the buck felt compelled to investigate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese sniper on Peleliu was exhibiting the same fixation. He wasn't firing at random movement or taking pot shots at distant targets. He was waiting with extraordinary patience for Marines to cross that specific gap, where his firing lane offered clean shots at a known distance. Donovan reasoned that if the sniper was that disciplined, that focused on one particular kill zone, he might also be that predictable. Show him a target in his preferred firing lane, and he'd almost certainly take the shot. The helmet-on-a-stick technique wasn't Donovan's invention. Trench fighters in World War I had used similar decoys to locate German snipers in the Somme and Verdun. British and French soldiers would raise helmets above trench parapets, sometimes equipped with false heads made of papier-mâché, to draw fire. The bullet holes in the dummy would reveal the angle of attack, allowing counter-snipers to calculate the enemy sniper's position through triangulation. By 1944, that technique had been largely forgotten or dismissed as obsolete in an era of mobile warfare and combined arms operations. But Peleliu wasn't mobile warfare. The 1st Marine Division had landed on September 15th, expecting a 4-day operation. Major General William Rupertus had confidently predicted the island would be secured quickly, perhaps 5 days at most, despite intelligence reports suggesting the Japanese garrison numbered more than 10,000 troops. Rupertus's optimism was based on previous Pacific campaigns, where Japanese forces had relied on suicidal banzai charges that, while terrifying, were tactically predictable and ultimately unsuccessful against disciplined American firepower. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commanding the Japanese forces on Peleliu, had studied those previous failures carefully. He understood that banzai charges wasted infantry in futile frontal assaults that American artillery and machine guns could massacre. On Peleliu, Nakagawa implemented radically different tactics. His troops would fight from prepared positions, cave systems, and fortified bunkers. They would avoid wasteful mass attacks and instead bleed the Americans through attrition, making every yard of coral and limestone cost lives that American mothers would feel in telegrams delivered by somber War Department officials. The result was a killing ground unlike anything the Marines had encountered. Peleliu's limestone ridges, particularly the Umabrogol pocket that would later be nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge, contained more than 500 caves, many expanded and connected by Japanese engineers using mining equipment that had been on the Posa Island for decades. The caves weren't simple shelters. They were multi-level defensive positions, with firing ports positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. Artillery and aerial bombardment, which had devastated Japanese positions on previous islands, was largely ineffective against cave systems that could withstand direct hits from naval gunfire. The Japanese snipers operating from these caves represented a particular nightmare for marine infantry. Unlike earlier campaigns where Japanese marksmen often revealed their positions through aggressive firing, Peleliu's snipers demonstrated remarkable fire discipline. They took single shots from concealed positions, then withdrew deep into cave systems before counterfire could arrive. Locating them through traditional methods, watching for muzzle flash, listening for reports, spotting scope, glint, was nearly impossible in the harsh sunlight and confusing terrain where every limestone outcropping looked identical. Staff Sergeant James Donovan had been thinking about this problem since the second day of the battle. Born in 1921 in a coal mining town near Pittsburgh, Donovan grew up in a household where problem-solving was survival. His father had worked the mines until a collapse in 1932 left him with a permanent limp and no pension. The family survived through his mother's boarding house and whatever odd jobs the Donovan brothers could find. James learned early that official channels, applications to relief agencies, and appeals to corporate managers rarely solved problems. Practical solutions, often improvised from whatever materials were available, worked better than waiting for help that might never arrive. When Donovan enlisted in the Marine Corps in March 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor, that problem-solving approach translated surprisingly well to military service, though not in ways the Corps always appreciated. At boot camp on Paris Island, Donovan received his first official reprimand for modifying his rifle sling to enable faster transitions between shooting positions. The modification worked flawlessly, improving his qualification scores by 12 points. His drill instructor wrote him up anyway for unauthorized equipment alteration. The pattern repeated through advanced training. Donovan would identify an inefficiency in doctrine or equipment, devise a practical solution, implement it successfully, and then receive discipline for not following established procedures. By the time his unit shipped out to the Pacific in February 1943, Donovan's service record contained 4 separate reprimands, alongside consistently high marks for tactical performance and leadership. His company commander, Captain William Richards, had pulled him aside before Peleliu and been characteristically blunt. "Sergeant, you're either going to end up with a Medal of Honor or a court-martial, possibly both. Try to. Avoid getting yourself killed while you figure out which one." Now, on September 17th, Donovan was contemplating his most significant violation yet. He'd observed the Japanese sniper's pattern over 6 hours. The shots all came from roughly the same direction, a northwest bearing toward the central ridges. The sniper was firing from an elevated position, probably 40 to 60 feet above the beach level, based on the downward angle of the fatal wounds Donovan had seen. Most importantly, the sniper waited for targets in one specific gap, suggesting he'd pre-ranged that distance and was confident in his ability to hit targets there. Donovan's plan required materials he didn't officially have. 3M, 1 helmets beyond his own, 3 bamboo poles approximately 8 feet long, ponchos for padding, and most critically, 3 Marines willing to position themselves at different observation points to track the bullet trajectory when the sniper took the bait. He acquired the helmets by visiting the beach where casualty collection waited for evacuation. Dead Marines no longer needed their helmets, and Donovan rationalized he was putting equipment to better tactical use than leaving it stacked with other personal effects. The bamboo came from shattered groves near the landing beaches, cut using a car-bar knife and selected for straightness. The poles needed to be long enough that a Marine could raise the helmet above cover while remaining protected himself. 8 feet was optimal, long enough for safety, but short enough to control precisely. Donovan tested several poles before finding 3 that were rigid enough to hold a helmet steady, but light enough to manipulate with one hand. The volunteers were easier to acquire than he'd expected. Lance Corporal Thomas Chen had watched his fire team leader die in that sniper's lane 4 hours earlier. When Donovan explained what he was planning, Chen volunteered immediately. "If we can kill that bastard," Chen said, "it's worth trying anything." Private First Class Robert Harrison and Private Donald Murphy followed Chen's lead. All three men had combat experience from Cape Gloucester, and all three understood that continuing to send Marines across that gap without neutralizing the sniper would mean more dead friends. The geometry of triangulation was straightforward in principle, but required precision in execution. Donovan positioned his three observers at points roughly 120 degrees apart, as far spread as the terrain allowed, while maintaining visual contact with the kill zone. Each man carried a compass and had been instructed to note the exact bearing toward the bullet impact the moment the sniper fired. Where those three bearing lines intersected would mark the sniper's position. The challenge was ensuring the observers could actually see the bullet strike. Donovan's solution was to coat the decoy helmets with a mixture of coral dust and water, creating a light-colored surface that would show impact clearly. He also positioned the decoys against backgrounds where muzzle flash or dust disturbance would be visible, dark cave mouths or shadowed rock faces. The observers would watch not just for the helmet's reaction, but for any visual indication from the firing position itself. At 09:15, Donovan raised the first decoy. He'd attached the helmet to the bamboo pole at a slight forward angle, creating the approximate silhouette of a Marine moving in a crouch. The poncho stuffing gave it mass that would react visibly to a bullet strike. Donovan positioned himself behind a coral outcropping, extended the pole slowly, and lifted the decoy into the kill zone at roughly the height and speed a cautious Marine might move. For 40 seconds, nothing happened. Donovan kept the decoy moving in a shuffling pattern, approximating how a real Marine would cross that gap while trying to stay low. He was about to lower it when the rifle shot cracked across the ridge. The helmet snapped backward, the pole vibrating in Donovan's hands from the impact. A second later, he heard the distinctive whine of the bullet continuing past the decoy and impacting coral somewhere behind his position. Donovan dropped flat, pulling the decoy down. He'd expected the shot, but the violence of it, the way the helmet had jerked like something alive, triggered his combat reflexes. He stayed motionless for 30 seconds, letting his heart rate settle, then looked toward his observation posts. Chen was waving, confirming he'd gotten a bearing. Harrison and Murphy followed seconds later with similar signals. The first test was successful. The sniper had taken the bait. Donovan needed multiple shots from different positions to confirm the triangulation and ensure the sniper was actually where the geometry suggested. He waited 5 minutes, giving the sniper time to resettle and convincing himself that the decoy had been a real Marine who was now either dead or too smart to try crossing again. The second decoy went up at 09:22, positioned 15 feet right of the first exposure point. Donovan used a different movement pattern this time, a quicker dash, as though the Marine was trying to sprint across the gap. The sniper's response was slower, nearly a full minute, but when it came, the shot was just as accurate. The helmet spun sideways off the pole, the bamboo cracking from the bullet's energy transfer. Chen, Harrison, and Murphy all confirmed their second bearings. Donovan could see from Chen's hand signals that the bearings were consistent. The lines would intersect at roughly the same point. One more test to be certain. The third decoy exposed at 09:35. Donovan deliberately used sloppy technique this time, wobbling the helmet as though the Marine carrying it was wounded or exhausted. The sniper fired within 20 seconds. The bullet struck the helmet's rim rather than center mass, but the impact was still violent enough to tear the helmet completely off the pole. 3 shots, 3 hits, 3 sets of bearing data. Donovan collected the information from his observers and spread out a map section on the coral behind his position. The 3 bearing lines, when drawn from the observation points, intersected in a triangular area roughly 40 yards across, centered on a particular cave mouth, about 300 yards northwest of the beach. The cave was positioned on the ridge face approximately 50 feet above the surrounding terrain, exactly where the wound angles had suggested. Donovan now faced a choice that would determine whether his improvised tactic would be remembered as brilliant field innovation or reckless insubordination that got Marines killed. He could report the sniper's probable location to Captain Richards and request artillery or air support to suppress the position. That was proper procedure, following chain of command and allowing designated support, assets to handle fire missions. Or he could take one additional step that violated every protocol in the book but might actually eliminate the threat immediately. Use the decoys to keep the sniper engaged while a counter-sniper team, which Donovan would personally lead, maneuvered into position for a direct shot. The decision-making process took approximately 15 seconds. Donovan had watched 4 Marines die in 6 hours. Artillery support would take at least 30 minutes to coordinate, probably longer given how many fire missions were being requested across the division's sector. Air support was completely unavailable, every aircraft devoted to supporting the push toward Peleliu's airfield. Meanwhile, more Marines were staging to move through that gap, and the sniper would kill everyone who tried. Donovan made his choice based on the same reasoning that had gotten him reprimanded 4 times. Official channels were too slow, and practical solutions saved lives, even if they violated regulations. He called over Corporal Vincent DiMaggio, the best marksman in the platoon, and Private First Class Harry Walsh, whose shooting scores at 200 yards exceeded 90% of the battalion. "We're going to kill that sniper," Donovan said. "I need you to trust me, follow my lead, and don't mention any of this if Captain Richards asks what we did out here today." The tactical plan was elegant in its simplicity. Chen would continue operating the decoys, exposing them at irregular intervals to keep the sniper engaged and focused on the kill zone. While the sniper's attention was fixed forward, Donovan would lead DiMaggio and Walsh on a flanking movement that would bring them to a firing position with a clear angle on the cave mouth. The movement would require approximately 40 minutes, crawling through coral outcroppings and limestone rubble while remaining below the sniper's line of sight. The risk was substantial. If the Japanese sniper had a spotter or if other enemy soldiers occupied adjacent caves, Donovan's team would be exposed and badly outnumbered. If the triangulation was wrong and the sniper was actually in a different location, they'd be stalking an empty cave while the real shooter continued killing Marines. And if Captain Richards discovered what Donovan was doing before the mission succeeded, the sergeant would face immediate relief and probable court-martial for conducting unauthorized combat operations. But Donovan had learned during his hard-scrabble depression childhood that calculated risks, taken when the potential reward justified the danger, were how practical problems got solved. The official way, filling out forms and waiting for approval, was how good ideas died in bureaucratic delays. At 09:45, Donovan's 3-man team began their approach. They moved in a crouch through the shattered coral, using every depression and shadow for concealment. The temperature was already approaching 100 degrees, humidity making every breath feel like inhaling hot soup. Donovan's utilities were soaked through with sweat within 5 minutes, and the coral dust coating everything turned to grey paste against his skin. The flanking route took them through territory that hadn't been completely cleared yet. Twice they passed cave mouths that might have contained enemy soldiers. Donovan's team moved silently, weapons ready, expecting at any moment to draw fire from positions they'd failed to scout. The first cave was empty, abandoned equipment and empty ration tins suggesting recent occupation. The second cave was sealed, the entrance collapsed by naval gunfire. At 10:15, they reached their intended firing position, a coral outcropping approximately 200 yards from the target cave at an oblique angle. The position offered clear line of sight to the cave mouth while remaining outside the sniper's primary firing arc. DiMaggio set up his M1903A4 Springfield with its Weaver scope, the standard Marine Corps sniper rifle. Walsh positioned himself as spotter with binoculars. Donovan watched the flanks and maintained communication via hand signals with Chen back at the original position. The plan required perfect coordination. On Donovan's signal, Chen would expose another decoy in the kill zone. The Japanese sniper would shift his attention and rifle toward that target. During the brief moment when the sniper was focused through his own scope, committed to his shot, DiMaggio would have perhaps 2 seconds to acquire and engage before the enemy sniper realized he was being hunted. The mathematics were unforgiving. At 200 yards, DiMaggio's round would take approximately a quarter second to reach target. The sniper's reaction time, if he heard the shot or saw muzzle flash, would be another quarter second. That gave DiMaggio 2 seconds maximum to fire, confirm, hit or miss, and either prepare a second shot or take cover depending on the result. Combat shooting, under time pressure against a partially concealed target, was exponentially harder than range qualification. At 10:23, Donovan gave the signal. Chen raised the fourth decoy, this one positioned at the left edge of the kill zone. Through his binoculars, Walsh could see movement in the cave mouth as the Japanese sniper shifted position and brought his rifle to bear. "Target visible," Walsh whispered. "Estimate 5 feet back from cave lip, prone position, rifle on bipod." DiMaggio's breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm that expert marksmen develop through thousands of practice shots. His finger took up trigger slack. The moment extended, that strange compression of time that combat shooters experience where seconds become long enough to notice details. The way the sniper's rifle barrel caught sunlight, the slight movement as he adjusted his aim, the exact instant when his body settled into complete stillness before firing. DiMaggio fired. The Springfield's report echoed, across the ridges, a sharp crack distinct from the Japanese rifle's signature. Through the scope, DiMaggio saw coral dust explode from the cave roof 18 inches above the sniper's position. Miss high. The Japanese sniper jerked backward reflexively, rolling away from the cave mouth into darkness. "Shit," DiMaggio muttered. "Lost him." For 30 seconds, nothing moved. The cave mouth was a black void, revealing nothing. Donovan's team stayed frozen, weapons ready, expecting return fire or movement that would indicate the sniper's next action. Chen kept the decoy exposed, maintaining the illusion that the target was still available. Then Walsh spotted movement, a flash of motion near a different cave mouth approximately 40 yards right of the first position. "Second cave," he hissed. "He's relocating." The Japanese sniper was doing what trained snipers always did when their position was compromised: displace immediately to a backup firing point. He would have pre-planned multiple positions and withdrawal routes. The fact that he was relocating under fire rather than withdrawing completely suggested he was still committed to defending his assigned sector. Range 230, Walsh calculated. Right edge of the visible opening, 3 feet back. DiMaggio tracked his rifle to the new position. The angle was worse, more of the cave interior was shadowed, and the sniper would be alert now, aware he was being hunted. The element of surprise was gone. Donovan made a decision that required either faith in his team's abilities or acceptance of likely failure. "Chen," he signaled. "Expose the decoy again." "Same position." Chen complied, raising the fifth helmet into the kill zone with the same shuffling movement pattern. The Japanese sniper, now operating from his backup position, had a slightly different angle but the same target. After a 20-second delay, probably while he confirmed his sight picture and range estimation, he fired. The helmet snapped, backward violently, another perfect hit. But this time, DiMaggio was ready. This time, the Springfield's 106-grain bullet found its target. Through the scope, DiMaggio saw the impact spray, not coral dust but the distinct red mist that meant human tissue. The Japanese sniper's rifle clattered forward, visible for a moment at the cave mouth before disappearing as the body collapsed backward. "Hit," DiMaggio confirmed. "Target down." Walsh kept his binoculars trained on both cave mouths for another 3 minutes. No movement, no indication of other Japanese soldiers responding to the shooting. The sniper had been operating alone, which was consistent with Japanese sniper doctrine that emphasized individual hunters rather than spotter-shooter pairs. Donovan's team waited another 5 minutes before beginning their withdrawal. Moving back across the same route they'd used for the approach, they reached friendly positions by 10:55. Chen had already collected the remaining decoys and disposed of the evidence of their unauthorized operation. The torn helmets and broken bamboo poles were buried in a shell crater that might not be examined for weeks. Captain Richards found Donovan at 11:20, shortly after the sergeant had filed a routine patrol report, claiming his team had conducted reconnaissance of the Western Ridge approaches. "Sergeant," Richards said, "that sniper that's been giving us problems, he seems to have stopped shooting. You know anything about that?" Donovan kept his expression neutral. "Last I heard, sir, the sniper fired several times around 0900, then went quiet. Haven't heard anything from that sector since mid-morning." Richards studied Donovan for a long moment. The captain wasn't stupid. He'd seen Marines carrying bamboo poles earlier, had probably noticed that several helmets from the casualty collection were missing, and certainly had noticed that Donovan, DiMaggio, and Walsh had been absent from the defensive perimeter for more than an hour during a period when the sniper mysteriously stopped being a problem. "I see," Richards finally said. "Well, Sergeant, whatever reconnaissance your team conducted this morning, it seems to have been effective. Continue with whatever operations you judge necessary to support the company's mission." It was as close to explicit approval as Donovan would receive for violating proper procedures. Richards was giving him retroactive authorization while maintaining plausible deniability about the specific tactics employed. The unstated message was clear. Results mattered more than methodology, but only if Donovan didn't force his superiors to officially acknowledge that unapproved operations were taking place. The immediate tactical problem was solved. Marines could cross that gap without dying. But Donovan's helmet-on-a-stick method had revealed something more significant: a systematic approach to the sniper problem that could be replicated across other sectors where Japanese marksmen were inflicting casualties. Over the next 4 days, as the 1st Marine Division continued its brutal advance toward the Umabrogel pocket, Donovan's technique spread through the battalion. Sergeants who'd heard about the sniper elimination asked how it had been done. Donovan explained the triangulation method, the observer positioning, and the coordination with counter-sniper teams. Within a week, at least 8 other Marine units were using variations of the decoy tactic to locate and eliminate Japanese snipers. The technique wasn't perfect. On September 23rd, a Marine Lance Corporal named Robert Brennan tried to replicate Donovan's success against a sniper in the northern ridges. Brennan exposed his decoy in a position where 3 Japanese soldiers had overlapping fields of fire. When the decoy drew fire, all 3 Japanese riflemen shot simultaneously, and the subsequent muzzle flashes revealed the Marines' observation posts. 2 Marines were killed by Japanese counterfire before the operation could be aborted. The failure demonstrated that the helmet decoy was a tool, not a magic solution, and required careful planning and understanding of the tactical situation. But when used properly, by Marines who understood both the method's principles and its limitations, the decoy technique worked remarkably well. Division-level after-action reports from Peleliu documented at least 17 separate incidents where decoys successfully located Japanese sniper positions that were subsequently eliminated. The actual number was probably higher, as not all platoon-level tactical innovations made it into official records. The broader impact of Donovan's improvisation became apparent during the Okinawa campaign in April 1945. By then, the helmet decoy technique had been incorporated into informal counter-sniper training that veteran NCOs provided to replacement Marines. When the 5th Marine Division landed on Okinawa facing even more intense sniper fire than Peleliu, platoon sergeants were already familiar with decoy tactics and began using them immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, operations officer for the 3rd Marines at Okinawa, later wrote in his combat journal that decoy operations had become so common that supply officers were requisitioning extra helmets specifically for counter-sniper work. One battalion on Okinawa reportedly used 43 helmets in decoy operations during a 2-week period in May 1945, exhausting their normal replacement inventory and requiring emergency resupply. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The institutional Marine Corps response to Donovan's innovation followed a familiar pattern that military historians would later recognize as characteristic of how armed forces adapt to battlefield realities. Official doctrine, written in training manuals and taught at service schools, moved slowly. The formal counter-sniper techniques that Marines were taught in 1945 were essentially unchanged from 1943. Use designated marksmen, employ artillery and air support, advance under smoke cover. But in formal knowledge, the practical understanding that experienced Marines passed to newer troops evolved rapidly. By mid-1945, every Marine infantry battalion had sergeants who understood decoy tactics and taught them to their squads. The technique was never formally documented in field manuals, never became official Marine Corps doctrine, and never appeared in training curricula at Paris Island or Camp Pendleton. Yet it saved lives throughout the final year of the Pacific War, and the fundamental principles continued influencing counter-sniper operations decades later. During the Vietnam War, Marine Corps scout snipers used variants of Donovan's triangulation method, sometimes employing mannequins or cardboard cutouts instead of helmets, to draw fire and locate Viet Cong marksmen. In Iraq during the 2003 invasion, Marine Corps units dealing with insurgent snipers in urban environments adapted the helmet-on-a-stick technique for use in building-to-building fighting, where exposing decoys through windows or around corners helped identify shooter positions without risking actual Marines. The mathematics of the technique remained constant across all these applications. Multiple observation points tracking the same shot could determine a firing position through triangulation with reasonable accuracy. The technology improved. Better compasses, GPS coordinates, ballistic computers, but the underlying geometry was identical to what Donovan had scratched out on a map section, using bearing lines and a protractor borrowed from the company clerk. The human cost, calculations that justified using the technique, also remained constant. On Peleliu, 4 Marines died in 6 hours from one sniper. After Donovan's team eliminated that threat, 0 Marines died crossing that gap over the next 3 days. The arithmetic was simple. 4 lives saved in the short term justified taking tactical risks that violated official procedures. But official Marine Corps records from Peleliu never mentioned Donovan's helmet decoys. The after-action report filed by 1st Marine Division documented intense sniper activity during the first week of the campaign, noted that casualties from sniper fire decreased significantly after September 20th, and attributed the improvement to aggressive counter-sniper operations by designated marksman teams. Staff Sergeant James Donovan wasn't mentioned by name in any divisional summary of the Peleliu campaign. The closest Donovan came to official recognition was a Bronze Star, with V device awarded in November 1944. The citation read, "For meritorious service in connection with operations against the enemy during the seizure of Peleliu Island from September 15th to September 23rd, 1944. The citation's description was deliberately vague. Staff Sergeant Donovan displayed exceptional initiative and tactical proficiency in developing innovative methods for neutralizing enemy sniper positions that were inflicting casualties on advancing Marine units. Donovan's company commander, Captain Richards, had written the original citation draft, with more specific language describing the decoy technique and the flanking maneuver that killed the sniper. Battalion Legal Review edited out those details, noting that describing unauthorized tactical operations in an award citation would create documentation that could later be used as evidence in disciplinary proceedings. The edited version preserved enough information to justify the medal while removing any specifics that might prove problematic if anyone ever questioned whether proper procedures had been followed. The institutional disconnect between battlefield innovation and official approval created what military sociologists later termed the NCO adaptation gap. The difference between what doctrine prescribed and what experienced sergeants actually did to accomplish missions. The gap existed because formal doctrine development moved at the pace of bureaucracy, while battlefield problems required immediate solutions that couldn't wait for updated field manuals. Senior Marine Corps leadership was aware of this gap and privately encouraged it, within limits. A memo from Major General Roy Geiger, commanding the 3rd Amphibious Corps at Peleliu, circulated to division commanders in October 1944, explicitly stated, "Initiative and tactical innovation by non-commissioned officers should be encouraged, provided such innovations do not needlessly endanger marine lives or compromise larger, operational security. Commanders should exercise judgment in determining when field expedient methods deviate too far from established procedures." Geiger's memo, classified as "for official use only" and not published in any document Marines could read, effectively authorized exactly what Donovan had done. Improvise solutions that worked, don't tell headquarters about the specific violations, accept responsibility if things went wrong, and let commanders maintain plausible deniability about unauthorized operations. It was institutional hypocrisy that nonetheless resulted in fewer Marines dying from preventable causes. The mathematical analysis that later military researchers applied to Peleliu's sniper casualties revealed the effectiveness of decoy tactics in quantitative terms. During the first 3 days of the campaign, before decoy methods became widespread, Japanese snipers averaged 0.7 kills per sniper per day. During days 4 through 10, after decoy techniques were being regularly employed, the average dropped to 0.3 kills per sniper per day. The decrease represented approximately 85 Marine lives saved during that week alone. The cost in equipment and time to achieve that result was minimal. A helmet cost the Marine Corps approximately $3 to manufacture and issue. A bamboo pole cost nothing, improvised from local materials. The time investment for conducting a decoy operation averaged 2 to 3 hours, including observation, triangulation, and counter-sniper engagement. Compared to artillery fire missions that required 30 minutes to coordinate and expended hundreds of dollars in ammunition, or airstrikes that tied up aircraft needed elsewhere, the decoy method was extraordinarily cost-effective. But cost-effectiveness calculations never appeared in official Marine Corps assessment of Peleliu tactics. The institutional focus remained on approved methodologies, designated marksman programs, counter-sniper schools, improved, optics procurement. These were all valuable improvements, but they required months or years to implement and scale across the entire Marine Corps. Donovan's technique could be explained in 5 minutes, and implemented with materials any Marine unit already possessed. That it never became official doctrine said more about how military institutions functioned than about the technique's tactical merit. The Japanese perspective on the decoy tactic revealed additional context about why it worked. After the war, American military intelligence officers interviewed surviving Japanese soldiers who had served on Peleliu, including several snipers captured on other islands who had trained in the same methods used at Peleliu. These interviews, compiled in a 1946 report titled Enemy Sniper Tactics, Pacific Theater, provided insight into Japanese sniper doctrine that explained why decoys were so effective. Japanese sniper training emphasized patience and fire discipline. Snipers were instructed to select firing positions with multiple exit routes, pre-range likely target areas, and fire no more than 3 to 5 shots before relocating. The doctrine was based on lessons learned from previous campaigns, where aggressive Japanese snipers had been quickly located and eliminated by American counterfire. But the doctrine contained a critical vulnerability. It assumed American Marines would only expose themselves when actually moving, not as part of a deliberate deception operation. Japanese snipers were trained to identify targets through movement patterns and exposure time. A helmet rising above cover for more than 2 seconds, moving in a pattern consistent with human locomotion, was treated as a legitimate target. The possibility that Americans might deliberately sacrifice equipment to draw fire was not addressed in Japanese training materials. One interviewed sniper, a corporal named Takeshi Yamamoto, who had served on Saipan using the same tactics employed at Peleliu, explained the psychology. When I saw the helmet moving, I thought it was an American Marine. My training was to shoot quickly before the target disappeared. I did not think the Americans would waste equipment for deception. We Japanese would never do such a thing, as every item was precious and difficult to replace. The cultural assumption about material conservation created a blind spot in Japanese tactical thinking. American forces, with their massive industrial production capacity, could afford to treat helmets as expendable if doing so eliminated threats. The Japanese military, operating under severe resource constraints by 1944, could not conceptualize using equipment as single-use decoys. Their doctrine assumed American behavior would mirror their own resource conservation necessities. This same pattern, cultural assumptions creating tactical vulnerabilities, appeared throughout the Pacific War in both directions. American forces initially underestimated Japanese willingness to fight to death because American military culture emphasized preservation of force and withdrawal when positions became untenable. Japanese forces consistently underestimated American material advantages because their own experience was of chronic shortages. Both sides eventually adapted, but the learning curve was measured in casualties. The decoy techniques spread through Marine Corps units via informal channels rather than official doctrine had one significant advantage: rapid evolutionary adaptation. Because the technique wasn't codified in manuals, Marines implementing it were free to modify and improve the method based on local conditions and Japanese responses. On Okinawa, some Marine units discovered that Japanese snipers would sometimes hold fire on an initial decoy exposure, but shoot at a second exposure in the same location, apparently waiting to confirm the target pattern before engaging. The Marine response was to use dummy exposures that deliberately appeared artificial, drawing fire that revealed the sniper's location without risking a well-crafted decoy that might be needed for actual triangulation. Other units found that Japanese snipers became suspicious of helmets that moved too consistently or mechanically. The Marines adapted by using irregular movement patterns, random pauses, and even attaching pieces of uniform material to create more realistic silhouettes. One sergeant on Okinawa rigged a helmet with a canteen and mess kit that rattled when moved, adding audible deception to the visual elements. These innovations happened because sergeants were solving immediate problems without waiting for official guidance. The decentralized nature of the adaptation meant techniques evolved faster than formal doctrine ever could, though it also meant useful innovations weren't systematically shared across the entire Marine Corps. A technique that worked brilliantly in one battalion might be unknown to units fighting 3 miles away. Staff Sergeant James Donovan survived Peleliu and participated in the Okinawa campaign from April through June 1945. His service record shows he was promoted to gunnery sergeant in May, unusual recognition of his tactical abilities despite his continued tendency to operate outside official channels. His final reprimand came in May 1945, when he modified a flamethrower to increase its range by 15 feet, a modification that worked perfectly but violated safety regulations regarding fuel pressure. After the Japanese surrender in August 1945, Donovan remained in the Marine Corps through 1953, serving during the Korean War, where he taught counter-sniper tactics to reconnaissance Marines. His Korean War service was notably more conventional than his Pacific War experience, possibly because the Marine Corps had by then incorporated some informal Pacific War innovations into official doctrine, reducing the need for field improvisation. Donovan retired from the Marine Corps as a Master Sergeant in 1953 and returned to Western Pennsylvania, where he worked as a machinist until 1982. He rarely discussed his military service, uncomfortable with the tension that arose when military historians discovered his role in developing decoy tactics. The one extended interview he granted, recorded by the Marine Corps Historical Division in 1978, provided most of the detailed information about the Peleliu sniper incident. In that interview, Donovan was characteristically modest about his innovation. "I didn't invent anything special. Trench fighters in World War I used dummy heads. I just applied something that used to work to a new problem." If there's anything worth noting, it's that the Marine Corps was smart enough to let sergeants figure out what worked, instead of insisting we do everything exactly by the book. Sometimes the book doesn't have the answer you need. That assessment captured both the strength and weakness of how the Marine Corps handled tactical innovation. The institutional culture permitted, even tacitly encouraged, NCO initiative when facing immediate battlefield problems. Sergeants like Donovan had latitude to experiment with unorthodox solutions that junior officers in more rigid military organizations would never have attempted. But the same institutional culture failed to systematically capture, document, and disseminate successful innovations. Techniques that saved lives in one unit remained unknown to other units that faced identical problems. The decoy method that Donovan proved effective in September 1944 was still being independently rediscovered by different Marine units throughout 1945, with each unit essentially relearning the same lessons. Modern military doctrine development, influenced by after-action reviews and systematic knowledge management practices developed since Vietnam, attempts to bridge this gap. Current Marine Corps counter-sniper training explicitly includes decoy techniques, triangulation methodology, and team coordination procedures descended directly from methods Donovan improvised on Peleliu. The techniques are now taught in formal schools, documented in field manuals, and incorporated into pre-deployment training. But the underlying tension between institutional procedure and field innovation remains unresolved. Marines still face situations where doctrine provides inadequate solutions and practical necessity demands improvisation. Junior leaders still make decisions about when rules can be bent and when they must be followed absolutely. The risk of court-martial for unauthorized operations remains balanced against the risk of casualties from adherence to procedures that don't fit the tactical reality. The mathematics that justified Donovan's decision in September 1944 continue to apply. When doctrine fails to address an immediate threat, when casualties are mounting from a problem that has a potential solution, how much procedural violation is acceptable to save lives? The calculus differs for every situation, every commander, and every moment. There are no formulas, only judgment calls made under pressure by leaders who will live with the consequences. The forgotten aspect of Donovan's story isn't the tactical technique itself, which military historians have documented thoroughly. It's the institutional amnesia about how the technique entered Marine Corps use. Through deliberate violation of procedures by an NCO who understood that asking permission would mean delayed approval, while Marines continued dying from a threat he knew how to eliminate. The helmet on a stick appears ridiculous until you understand the geometry that makes it work. The sergeant who implements it appears insubordinate until you understand the cost calculations that justify the violation. And the Marine Corps that both tacitly authorizes and officially ignores such innovations appears contradictory until you understand that winning wars requires both rigid discipline and flexible adaptation, somehow balanced in ways that permit sergeants to solve problems while maintaining institutional order. Staff Sergeant Donovan's helmet decoy became one small thread in the complex tapestry of how American forces adapted to Pacific War realities. It wasn't a war-changing innovation like radar or amphibious doctrine. It didn't appear in any strategic assessments or theater-level planning documents. It was simply one sergeant's practical solution to one tactical problem, replicated and modified by other Marines who faced similar situations, effective enough to save lives, but small enough to remain invisible in official histories. The measure of its success wasn't in awards or recognition, but in arithmetic. Marines who crossed that gap after September 17, 1944, survived at significantly higher rates than those who crossed before. The Japanese sniper who had dominated that sector was dead, killed by Marines who used a technique their training had never covered and their manuals had never mentioned. Decades after the war, a Marine Corps training officer reviewing historical combat lessons attempted to calculate how many similar innovations had occurred during the Pacific War, small-scale tactical adaptations that saved lives but went undocumented. The officer's estimate, based on after-action report, analysis, and veteran interviews, suggested at least 200 significant field modifications to doctrine across the various campaigns from Guadalcanal through Okinawa. The vast majority of those innovations, like Donovan's helmet decoy, were never formally documented or incorporated into training. They existed in the institutional memory of experienced Marines who taught newer troops through demonstration and explanation, transmitted as verbal knowledge rather than written procedure. When those Marines retired or died, much of that practical wisdom disappeared. The current Marine Corps Warfighting Laboratory, established in the 1990s to systematically capture and evaluate tactical innovations, represents an institutional acknowledgement that the old model of informal knowledge transfer was inadequate. The laboratory attempts to do formally what sergeants like Donovan did informally: identify problems, develop solutions, test effectiveness, and disseminate successful techniques throughout the force. Whether this institutional approach can replicate the adaptive speed that Donovan demonstrated, solving a problem in hours that would have taken official channels weeks or months to address, remains an open question. Bureaucracy brings systematic evaluation and widespread dissemination, but rarely matches the innovation speed of individual initiative under pressure. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.